There aren't many safer gaming opinions than saying that AC2 is your favorite Assassin's Creed. It has the highest Metacritic score in the series, it introduced one of the most popular gaming protagonists of all time, and fan polls almost always have it in the top 2. While I am prone to the occasional dissenting opinion when it comes to AC, this is not one of them. I love Assassin's Creed 2, and I consider it my favorite game in the franchise. From the moment I came home from my local Blockbuster video and heard Jesper Kid's iconic score for the first time, I was hooked, and in my dozen 100% playthroughs since, it has yet to lose its charm for me. But while I don't intend to delve too far into the negative, I do think that saying this series peaked 15 years ago is just as much a criticism of later entries as it is praise for this one. As great as the game is, it very much feels like a product of 2009, and in fact I'd go as far as to say I don't believe there is a single aspect of AC2 that hasn't been improved by later games. The parkour, the combat, the world design, and even the story, in my opinion, although I know not everyone would agree, have been done better since. And yet when I look at AC2 as a full experience, I don't actually think any of these other games come close. Where other AC games excel in some categories and tank in quality in others, AC2 is consistently a great game that succeeds in achieving what it wants to achieve. And while I don't want to get too deep into nostalgia here, especially as someone who definitely isn't on the hate train for the modern AC games, there is something different about the way AC2 was made. People nowadays may not remember that AC was, very briefly, not this yearly franchise with 200 million copies sold. Between 2007 and 2009, it was just the child of a dedicated team at Ubisoft Montreal who were trying to help their new IP find its feet. It doesn't have this strain to fit into a wider franchise with a dozen entries in it, nor does it suffer from being outsourced to 6 different studios to speedrun development. In that way, the game was kind of the last of its kind. It may not have the deepest mechanics, or the best graphics, or the best side content, but when you look at the game as a whole, it becomes very clear to me that every game in this franchise still very much lives in the shadow of Assassin's Creed 2. I've spent a lot of time on my channel talking about the history of this franchise, specifically the shift from new up-and-coming IP to giant financial powerhouse as it is today. You can check out those videos, which I will hopefully remember to link below for a more all-encompassing overview, but I will briefly go over how AC2 came to be for the uninitiated. Before we even talk about Assassin's Creed, I think it's worthwhile to note that in the 2000s, Ubisoft was awesome. A lot of people who spend time on YouTube might be too young to have lived through it, but back in the day, a Ubisoft logo was a mark of value. Rayman, Splinter Cell, Beyond Good and Evil, Ghost Recon, Rainbow Six, Far Cry, a wide array of innovative games in the world of platformers, tactical shooters, stealth games, and more. As many of you already know, Assassin's Creed 1 started out as a reboot of the popular Prince of Persia franchise. In 2003, creative director Patrice Desilets headed the immensely successful Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, and while that game got its own sequels, Desilets was sent to work on another reboot to keep the franchise going after that trilogy ended. This idea eventually morphed into the original Assassin's Creed, released in 2007 to mixed reviews. The game was praised for how unique it felt with its Holy Land setting, emphasis on social blending, and fluid animation standing out in particular. On the other hand, many people found the mission structure to be repetitive, the world to be empty, and the sci-fi elements to be half-baked. It wasn't the slam dunk Sands of Time was from a critical perspective, but it had potential, and the team at Ubisoft Montreal was immediately sent to work on a sequel that could build off these ideas in a way that might have wider appeal. Fans started getting hints at what this might be after Ubisoft released a teaser in April of 2009 that showed off images like the Hidden Blade and the Da Vinci flying machine. We got official confirmation that AC2 would take the series to the new locale of Renaissance Italy with a new protagonist 10 days later when Game Informer got the game's official announcement. Now, Ubisoft committed hard to Assassin's Creed 2 very early on. Not only did we get the usual big E3 announcement trailer and subsequent marketing run, but we also got a fully live-action 3-episode prequel to the game that was released in the months prior to AC2 coming out. As we all know, this confidence in the game was well placed. It came out during the holiday season of 2009 to rave reviews and very solid sales. It set the pieces in motion that would make Assassin's Creed Ubisoft's greatest cash cow, and arguably rewrite the company's entire future business model. Normally, I don't include a history chapter when I make these review-type videos, but here, all this stuff actually does matter. There is a normalcy to the development of Assassin's Creed 2. It was mostly made by the same creators as the first game, and it was allowed a relatively typical dev period to respond to criticisms of AC1, which is how sequels should be made. As we know now, this was the last time an AC game was made like this. It was the last time only one AC game was in development at any given time, it was the last time AC had a single consistent dev team, and it was the last time an AC game was made with the intent of the franchise being a trilogy. Immediately after AC2, it was determined that Ezio would get a sequel to capitalize on his success. Looking back, we know that internal disagreements between higher-ups and Desilets led to his exit from the company before AC Brotherhood could be completed. We know that the team at Montreal was broken up and teams all over the world were set to start making Assassin's Creed games in rotation to put them out year after year. In fact, after AC2, we didn't go a year without an AC game until 2016, 7 games later. And as I have also made clear, I'm not one of those people who believes AC has been on a constant decline. I'm a big fan of many games post-AC2. But the point I'm trying to make is that Assassin's Creed was all too briefly a franchise where an individual entry could be the sole focus of a dedicated team, instead of just being one piece of Ubisoft's 10-year plan. There is a passion behind AC2 and a lack of corporate meddling that we never saw again in this series. Even at the highest of highs this franchise has reached since, it has always been held back by Ubisoft's need to milk the games dry. Whether it be lack of dev time, an inability to respond to criticism due to overlapping dev periods, or an overabundance of overpriced microtransactions, every game since AC2 has shown strain from Ubisoft's oversaturation of Assassin's Creed. And I don't say all this to imply AC2 deserves praise just for the purity of its development. What happened to later entries doesn't automatically make AC2 good. But luckily the game is good, and that's what the rest of this video is going to argue. But I think it's still fair to start this discussion with the reminder that AC wasn't always the cash cow it is today, and that really does show in the final product here. Another thing a lot of you weren't around to remember is that we didn't always know Assassin's Creed would be a time-hopping anthology. There was some surprise when it was announced that AC2 would not be a follow-up to Altair's story in the Holy Land, and would instead take players to Renaissance Italy with a totally new protagonist. This first crack at translating the mechanics of AC1 to a new setting knocked the ball out of the park. Renaissance Italy is beautiful, fun to traverse, and chock full of artistic personality. Before anything else, I have to acknowledge the importance of the unparalleled tone setter that is the music of Jesper Kyd. I have mentioned this before, but it was not the interesting concept of the series or my love of Prince of Persia that made me a fan of AC. The moment I was truly sold was when the title dropped in AC2, and I heard Ezio's family for the first time in my life.
It is a good life we lead, brother.
At best, may it never change.
And may it never change us.
The hauntingly bittersweet vocals of Melissa Kaplan and the wide shot of Florence hooked me on this series in a way that never fully went away even after all of Ubisoft's missteps. The Ezio trilogy in general makes fantastic use of ambient music in ways that later games bafflingly opted not to. Each location has its own theme and its own chase music, and the game is never quiet, and that injects a whole nother layer of personality on top of what is already there. In terms of the maps themselves, one of my favorite aspects of them is the variety. Florence is a dense cultural hub with so many towering landmarks to see, wonderfully encapsulating this Renaissance setting, and that contrasts well with the much more brightly colored Venice with its eroding brick and limestone buildings and the iconic canals. Further diversity is found in the marshlands of Romagna and the open regions of Tuscany, where finding yourself a horse is often best practice. There is a sort of painterly vibe to the graphics in this game that no other game in the series ever adopted. I am not someone who cares a ton about graphics, but if we're being totally honest, AC2 was kind of ugly for a AAA game even in 2009. I mean, the hair and beards were just flat shapes. but it leans hard into that Renaissance painting look with the color palette and textures totally overshadowing the lack of polygons. This is a beautiful game, fancy graphics or not. Beyond appearances alone, there are so many more ways you can actually interact with the world compared to AC1, and sometimes even compared to later games. This was back when high profile and low profile were more of a thing, so civilians would react with shock and confusion if you started climbing a building in a busy street, in contrast to later games where you can sprint full tilt without anyone saying anything.
Has he lost his mind?
This also ties into the notoriety system, where illegal actions will increase your visibility to local guards in that region, requiring you to tear down posters, bribe heralds, or kill corrupt witnesses to regain anonymity. Unlike AC1, there is an actual economy system in this game that has you spending florins on gear and other items to improve your character. I will never forget the iconic voice lines of the doctors, blacksmiths, tailors, and art dealers you meet.
And rosemary poultices for your bunions.
I always found it way more immersive to have to go to the right merchant based on my own needs compared to the more modern inclination to have a guy on your map with a money symbol over their head who just sells you everything in the game. There is even a basic real estate investment system in your hub in Monteriggioni. It is incredibly satisfying to watch your little town grow from a dilapidated strip of buildings to a bustling hub. Completing these renovations earns you passive income as a landlord, which is way more complex as a system, again, than anything we saw in AC1. That's not saying any of these systems are particularly deep, but they make the world feel like it reacts to your gameplay, and they paint a picture of Ezio that sets him apart from Altair. While Altair always stayed in the shadows, Ezio is willing to use money to bribe his way to anonymity if he makes too much noise, and he goes home to a manor instead of a commune. All of this being said, if you watched my rankings of the AC settings, which was the first video I ever put out, you will know that I put the world of AC2 at third, behind AC4 and Origins. Still very high, but not the best of the best for me. This was before the infamous Ubisoft formula was set in stone, and as divisive as that formula is due to it being so thoroughly overdone, there is a reason so many franchises adopted it. Back in 2009, there wasn't much of a clear template for what made an open-world game fun. One of the biggest differences between the newer games and AC2 is how little there actually is to do outside of the main plot. For me, the most interesting pieces of side content in AC2 are the tombs, which are linear platforming levels that are a great change of pace from the open-world content, and the truth puzzles, which do a ton of cool and satisfyingly creepy world building surrounding the assassins and Templars, and give the player a fun thing to do outside of the main gameplay loop. Outside of these two activities, you have a lot of what feels like padding. 100 collectible feathers, a bunch of chests, and an assortment of contracts for assassinations, beating up cheating husbands, delivering letters, and doing races. I'm not saying this is nothing, nor am I saying that I want my worlds to be full of icons and collectibles, but compared to a game like AC Brotherhood, which came out only 1 year later, this world does feel very empty. You look at that game and it has the Borgia control system, the Templar hunts, the Christina missions, the Leonardo machine missions. In general, there's just so much gameplay and narrative substance outside of the story that isn't just busy work, while in AC2, beating the main plot wraps most of the worthwhile content. Like I said, this was common at the time. I recently went back to play Infamous, which came out the same year, and its open world is pretty rough. But it's still worth noting that this is a category where the game can be a bit hard to go back to. That said, AC2 may be dated as an open world title, but the depth of the world's systems was a huge improvement over AC1, and the level of NPC interactivity is honestly better than some recent titles. The meticulously crafted art design and music are so immersive, and all of this is why Renaissance Italy is still one of my favorite AC settings all these years later. It sets up a common theme for this video. For every one thing that was clearly improved by later games, there are two things I miss that never really hit quite as hard as they did here. AC1 was a very ambitious game, but it wasn't always fun. From the moment you get control of Ezio, it is readily apparent that one of the major goals of the team with AC2 was to up that fun factor without sacrificing what made the first game so unique. And in a lot of ways I'd say they did succeed. Parkour is largely the same from AC1, but it is sped up to better accommodate the larger buildings and more diverse architecture of Renaissance Italy. You have small additions like these lanterns you can swing on to turn corners, and the ability to swim, which was a godsend after water was instant death in the first game. The combat additions were more drastic, but maintained the flair of AC1. Back in the day, it was incredibly rare to see a game where your character's blade would clash with the enemies and only hit them directly when you killed them. There is a groundedness, along with the obviously fantastical nature of this combat system, that was totally unique to Assassin's Creed. And so, leaning hard into this, AC2 adds a ton of animations and player abilities that didn't exist in AC1. The new weapons alone add what feel at first like an endless number of new animations, with Ezio wielding spears, two-handed swords, maces, daggers, and even a broom if you can find one. There is an incredible attention to detail put into these animations. I feel like everyone remembers the first time they countered a heavy with a spear and their weapon split in half, only for Ezio to briefly assess the situation and stab his enemy with both halves. So cool. But it isn't just animations that are improved. There are a ton of new combat mechanics introduced in this game. You can fight with your hidden blade instead of just using it to counter, you can disarm opponents and use their weapons against them, you can throw sand to blind multiple enemies at a time, you can execute enemies from a grab, and if you can get behind an enemy, it is always an instant kill. All of this is on top of the basic counter system and rhythm combo kill system where timing each attack as the last one lands instantly kills your enemy. While I will get into criticisms in a moment, I do think that AC2 deserves more credit than it gets for just how much more layered it is when it comes to combat compared to AC1. This method of layering new tools onto an existing system was also applied to stealth, which gives the player access to smoke bombs, the hidden gun, and the poison blade. Ezio can air assassinate and double assassinate, which were big changes, and he can hide bodies, which I love as a stealth fan. However, I would argue that much more interesting are the additions to social stealth. In AC1, it felt like you had to spend a lot of your time slowly walking around with your hands clasped together due to the sparseness of ways in which you could use your environment to stay hidden. The biggest way AC2 expands this is with the systemic blending system. In AC1, you could hide among groups of white-robed monks because you looked like them. As I've said, AC2 prioritizes fun over realism and lets you become invisible in any large group in the game. This massively increases the opportunities for social stealth and makes the environment feel like so much more of an asset to the player. AC2 generally gives you more ways to make stealth more proactive as opposed to reactive. You can throw coins to rile up citizens and get the attention of guards, you can hire thieves or mercenaries to cause a distraction, or you can hire a group of courtesans to make yourself completely invisible to your enemies. Honestly, a lot of these mechanics break the game, but it's really fun to discover all these methods of infiltration outside of shedding blood. Everything in AC2 is bigger than AC1, and I would say a lot of it is better, but not everything. A lot of the challenge was stripped away from the first game, and even with all the improvements, there is a noted clunkiness to playing AC2 that puts a lot of new players off. I want to start this part of the discussion by talking about the parkour, because while I have more misgivings about the combat and stealth, I believe the parkour system set up between AC1 and AC Revelations is still the best iteration the series has had to this day. As much as I love the animation work in AC3 and the parkour up and down utility in AC Unity, I am always upset when I am reminded of just how much precision control was taken away after the Ezio trilogy. A lot of people just play AC games by holding buttons and auto-parkouring everything in their path, and I get that. The games are very much built to accommodate that playstyle. But it was abilities like side ejects, animation canceling, and catch ledge that allowed for experimentation outside of that basic gameplay loop. As I've stated in my AC3 video, these functions started getting phased out immediately after Revelations and never fully came back. You could no longer cancel an animation at any time with an eject, and catch ledge was now tied to the analog stick in a way that was finicky and inconsistent. And then, despite the depth of the vertical control and world design of Unity, ejects and catch ledge were even less consistent there. Animations were becoming prettier and prettier, but player control was being stripped away long before the complaints that came with the pared-down system of AC Origins. So if I like the parkour system so much, what's the problem here? Well, I think you'll notice a lot of my praise is not just for what AC2 has, but for what later games took away. Like I said, animation work and mechanics like parkour up and down were awesome improvements, but by now there should be a system that has stuff like that without sacrificing the player agency of the Ezio trilogy. But it's been a decade and a half, and that system doesn't exist. And so AC2 remains the best in the series for me, not because it's a perfect system, because it isn't, but because no game since has ever built on AC2's best ideas. We've gotten so many examples of different improvements that could be made to the parkour of AC2 that work really well, but they have always come with big regressions with every subsequent title. However, I do have one big issue with the parkour in AC2, and it is a problem I have with pretty much every AC game, and it is how little the game incentivizes you to actually explore the system. Outside of things like the VR challenges we saw in Brotherhood, advanced gameplay is almost never encouraged in this series. The only activities dedicated to traversal in this game are the races and the tombs, and while they are enjoyable, I always feel like I'm just holding auto parkour along a set path, instead of making my own decisions in any real way. The tombs especially just don't seem to respect the player's intelligence very much. One thing these games carry over from Sands of Time is the camera tour you get every time you enter a big platforming room. In Sands of Time, the purpose of this was to help you get your bearings as you solve the various timing and reflex puzzles. But AC2 isn't really a platformer in the same way, and so you get these camera overviews, but they really just show you where you're going to end up holding sprint and high profile, with the game rarely asking you to do anything more advanced than moving the analog stick to the side slightly. The rare times you do need to do a side eject, it makes it blatantly obvious, and every time you need to do a back eject, it pulls up the tooltip because the devs just had no faith in the player's critical thinking ability. I'm not saying this to say that AC2 should have been a hardcore puzzle platformer, because this isn't Prince of Persia, it's not that kind of game. But there's just so much potential in this traversal system for fun gameplay challenges. They built up a system that gives the player so much control, only to force them so often into linear pathways anyway. And one of the things about parkour in this series that upsets me so much is that it never lived up to its potential as a mechanic that could have had as many fun activities based around it as stealth or combat do in other games. This idea of the game not incentivizing more complex play is also very visible in the combat. Despite all the improvements over AC1 that I've mentioned, most people still just counter and combo kill their way through every fight because that's the most efficient thing to do. The fastest way to kill all enemies is to be reactive and not proactive, and so people tend to just counter and combo kill since the only reward for doing anything else is looking cool. Civilization game designer Soren Johnson once famously wrote that given the opportunity, players will optimize the fun out of their game. While you can certainly criticize players for this, the truth is that it is the job of the developers to build balanced systems where exploration of the mechanics is rewarded. I find myself comparing this to Arkham Asylum, which came out the same year as AC2, and it also gets some complaints for its simplicity with its attack and counter system. But the difference is that Arkham goes to great lengths to encourage the player to do more than just sit and counter. Most of the abilities you have access to require building up your combo meter, which in turn requires constantly switching between offense and defense. The Arkham games are much better about using enemy archetype diversity to encourage the player to use tools other than punching and countering, while in AC2, countering and using the dodge will get you past pretty much every enemy in the game. While Arkham does its best to give players concrete gameplay reasons to explore its systems, even ranking your combat performance in the challenge mode, AC2 is content to make that intrinsic desire to feel good the only reward. I think it is healthy to have a wide variety of different combat systems in the gaming industry, and I certainly don't think every game needs to be Devil May Cry or Dark Souls. However, for all its additions, combat in AC2 can feel very shallow once the novelty of the cool animations wears off. Finally, we're talking about stealth again, and I've been very open about my belief that stealth has always been a weak link in this franchise. Most stealth systems are based around hiding from enemies and sneaking up on them, and that aspect of AC has always been behind the curb. You have no crouch or cover systems, and the guards are always spaced far apart, so a lot of regular stealth revolves around slowly walking up to enemies and killing them one by one very easily. However, social stealth was the name of the game back in the day, and like I said, AC2 made some really cool improvements there with systemic blending and all these other systems. But here we see one of the pitfalls of Ubisoft's attempt to streamline AC1's gameplay structure. Even though you have more social stealth tools in AC2, I find that the game provides fewer social stealth opportunities throughout the main story. I talked in my Illusion of AC video about how Ezio doesn't actually stealth kill that many targets in this game in general. While Uberto Alberti, Emilio Barbarago, and Ludovico Orsi get stealth missions, you kill Vieri de Pazzi, Silvio Barbarago, and Dante Moro in mercenary battles, Francesco de Pazzi, Carlo Grimaldi, and Checco Orsi in chase scenes, and the deaths of Jacopo, Marco, and Savonarola are essentially scripted sequences, plus of course your final target being a fistfight with the Pope. Stealth in general isn't emphasized as much in AC2 because the game was more interested in giving you a wider variety of fun missions a la GTA. I think there is value in this, and I would go as far as to say the missions of AC2 are a fair amount more fun than a majority of what we had in AC1, but stealth sees the biggest consequences. Of the targets mentioned above, only Uberto, the tutorial target essentially, has an open area where you can really use social stealth to get to him. The idea of hiding in plain sight to reach your target is seen as a staple of this series, but in the main story it really isn't an option all that often here. While almost every mission in AC1 required some form of hiding in plain sight, in AC2, when there is stealth in the game, it's very common for it to drop Ezio in a restricted area where guards will detect you instantly, and there are no crowds or benches or other hiding places. This means you are locked into the traditional stealth system, which, as I have said, is incredibly bare bones. The type of mission that actually consistently encourages social stealth in AC2 is the tailing missions, because those actively force you to traverse crowded areas where the goal is not getting caught, as opposed to killing someone or getting to someplace. As overdone and often poorly done as tailing missions are, I do miss content that put that emphasis on social stealth like that. I know I just spent a long time being critical, but I don't think most of this stuff is bad. Aside from the traditional stealth, which was way below industry standard even at the time, there's a ton of value in every gameplay component in AC2, and the level to which it brought new life to the conceptually interesting but mechanically sometimes dull gameplay of AC1 deserves a lot of credit. But if I had to boil down the main issue with a lot of these gameplay ideas, I would say that every mechanic, be it parkour, combat, or stealth, feels like a first draft of something that would get really good in later releases. The parkour feels like a product of 2009 with its stiff movements and limited animation set, and yet later games never seemed to understand just how valuable the player agency of this system was, opting to focus more on the animations. Combat is shallow and unbalanced, in a way that other games have improved on, but its groundedness and the variety of awesome finishers allow it to stand on its own next to later AC combat systems that may be more engaging, but are also a lot more derivative. And stealth has so many great ideas when it comes to social blending, but it lacked the confidence to really lean into it, and unfortunately that confidence is something Ubisoft never found, eventually shifting to a wider focus on crouch and cover stealth with Unity, and later removing social stealth entirely with Origins. A move I can't even really blame them for, given how little they were doing with it over the course of the decade prior. I do believe gameplay in general is a weak link of AC2. The game is heavily carried by its atmosphere, setting, world design, and characters. But the greatest compliment I can give the gameplay of this game is that there was nothing like it in 2009, and there is nothing like it in 2024 either. It has an unshakable identity, committing hard to unique systems even if it doesn't quite flesh them out to their full potential. You look at AC2 and it might not hold up perfectly in the modern era, but I think you can clearly see so many directions they could have taken with the stealth, parkour, and combat that no other studio was even conceiving of at the time. Improved versions of these gameplay systems could have cornered their own chunk of the market. Instead, a lot of what I think truly set AC2 apart was lost as the series began to shed its most unique ideas. So here we are, finally talking about the story, the part of AC2 that I'd say is remembered the most fondly. My own opinions on it are twofold. On the one hand, it remains one of my favorite in the series. On the other hand, upon revisiting it, it is definitely sloppier than I remember when I played it back in 2009. I still connect a lot with Ezio's story, but the wonderful performances carry what is otherwise a solidly okay narrative to me. Like many other aspects of AC2, a lot of focus is put on being more streamlined and accessible than AC1. One way they responded to criticism of the first game is by heavily reducing the role of Desmond and the modern day. He is still the anchor of the narrative, but while AC1 interspersed him throughout the entire story, in AC2 he shows up right at the beginning and end, with only one short narrative beat in the middle. It was kind of a shame to see them cut the modern day back so much instead of finding ways to make it more interesting, but it admittedly does make it feel less intrusive than in AC1. This crew of Desmond, Rebecca, Sean, and Lucy made me feel like they were onto something. They didn't get much time to shine, but the chemistry of this group worked really well. And of course, we got those in-game truth puzzles where Subject 16 was leaving hints for Desmond along with a ton of modern-day world building. In hindsight, most of that was wasted, but at the time, I was actually excited to see where it was going to go. With modern day cut back, there was more room for the meat of the game. While AC1 was slavishly dedicated to its investigation and assassination structure, AC2 is a much more typical action-adventure story, full of set pieces and colorful characters. We see this from the very beginning as the game opens on our suave young protagonist getting into street fights, sneaking into his girlfriend's room, doing chores, and getting reprimanded by his parents. Ezio Auditore is a kid. He is brash and makes bad decisions, and he says the wrong things at the wrong time.
May I come in?
Fine, but only for a minute.
A minute is all I need.
Indeed.
Well, wait, that came out wrong.
And he isn't nearly as good at hiding his exploits as he thinks he is.
I have plenty of outlets.
I meant besides vaginas.
Mother.
But he is dedicated to his family, and he is charismatic enough that you want to root for him, spoiled or not. The game does a great job in the first hour of showing you the beauty of a life the player knows cannot last. It doesn't rush in like AC Syndicate, but it doesn't slog on like AC3 either. It makes it all the more effective when the inevitable fall of the Auditore family is enacted. Ezio's father Giovanni was an assassin who had unearthed a Templar conspiracy, and in retaliation, all the men in the family are arrested except for Ezio, who was out running an errand. Despite his best efforts, Ezio is forced to watch his family's execution, helpless to save them. And for me, the boldest decision was to kill Petruccio, Ezio's sickly 13-year-old younger brother. And I don't just mean that because he's a child. There are a lot of games that do the revenge story with the death of a child, and sometimes it just feels like edge, but here, it was meaningful. Early in the game, Petruccio asks Ezio to collect some feathers for a project he's excited to unveil. The child is killed, and Ezio never finds out what Petruccio was planning. But the feathers remain around the world, and so the primary collectible in the game is a constant reminder of the impossibility of closure when grieving a loved one. And I thought that was a lot more effective than what we see in other games. Revenge setups like this are as cliché as they come, and yet I found myself truly feeling the void left by the life stolen from Ezio. The game establishes that Ezio loves his family, will fight for the Auditore name, and isn't ready for responsibility. In a matter of moments, his family is decimated, the Auditore name is all but erased, and he is left to take care of his mother and sister himself. No other game in the series so thoroughly presents the extent to which a person's life is changed by grief. The person he was can no longer exist, and by the end he is something else entirely. It is from here that the game takes on largely the same structure as every other AC title. Ezio now has a family to avenge and a list of men to kill, and each sequence is dedicated to a particular target. What I appreciate is how well contained each chapter is when it comes to the characters you meet and the enemies you face. While Altair was largely solitary in his work, Ezio gains a new ally with every subsequent target. Memorable characters like the brutish but refined Bartolomeo and the enigmatic La Volpe keep the story dynamic, chapter by chapter, continuously giving us new voices. And with that, I want to go over just how fantastic the voice work is in this game. The accents are wonky sometimes, but Roger Craig Smith portrays Ezio with such a perfect balance of charisma and vulnerability, and without him I just don't think the story would have worked as well. All of Ezio's allies and enemies are portrayed fantastically as well, and I especially want to shout out Lita Tresiera, who portrayed the harsh but playful thief Rosa. Tresiera passed away shortly after AC2 came out, but her performance is as wonderful today as it was back then. Your most consistent ally is Leonardo da Vinci, who in the fictional world of this game was already acquainted with the Auditores through Ezio's mother. It is Leonardo who repairs Ezio's father's hidden blade for him to use, and he provides further upgrades throughout the game. But really more importantly than any of that, his portrayal as an awkward genius is endearing, and his genuine friendship with Ezio is a highlight not just of AC2, but of the series as a whole. Also a core ally is Ezio's Uncle Mario, who becomes Ezio's mentor and conveniently enough has a mansion where the family can live, while Ezio travels Italy killing people. It is Mario who tells Ezio about the assassins and his lineage, and who offers Ezio the chance to join their ranks. However, in an interesting bit of narrative decision-making, Ezio initially refuses, stating he would rather prioritize getting his family safely to Spain, leaving the conflict behind. Now, obviously this doesn't stick, and Ezio joins the fight regardless, But this takes us down a convoluted path when it comes to Ezio's connection to the Assassins that doesn't fully rear its head until the end of the game, so we're just going to put a pin in this topic for now. Ezio does decide he will take the fight to the Templars who helped orchestrate his family's deaths. His first kill is Uberto Alberti, the former friend and ally of Giovanni, who betrayed the Auditores and facilitated their execution. His death is among the most raw and satisfying assassinations in the series, and from here Ezio has his list of names.
The Auditori are not dead! I'm still here! Me! Ezio! Ezio Auditore!
In Florence, he dispatches the Pazzi family one by one as they attempt to overthrow the Medici family, and in Venice he tracks down and kills the members of the Barbarigo family as they attempt to infiltrate the position of Doge. The Templars have very traditional motives here, mostly focused on putting their own in positions of power or getting rid of politicians who do not support them. I will say that by far the biggest loss when compared to AC1 is the lack of fleshed out confessional scenes with these targets. Whenever Altair killed a target, we got what remained to this day the best written scenes in the series, where he and his victim would argue about their beliefs and challenge the player's own moral conceptions in fairly intelligent ways. This is not the case in AC2. Generally, the targets here are mustache-twirling baddies with very little in the way of redeeming motives. This isn't to say these characters are entirely one-dimensional, as there are certainly times where the game effectively humanizes them, but these are exceptions to the rule, and more intelligently written enemies are missed. Even still, there are some really cool set pieces related to these targets. The flying machine infiltration is iconic, and the parading of Francesco de Pazzi's body is straight out of a horror game. The story isn't without its contrivances, however, and the game does get a bit lazy with its integration of history sometimes. For example, Ezio is just barely too slow to stop the Pazzi conspiracy in Florence and save Doge Mocenigo in Venice, but they don't actually write a reason why. He has advanced knowledge of these plots, but he is just too slow to act, because in order to be historically accurate, he has to be too slow to act. They could have at least written him getting outplayed, which would have made the Templars seem smarter, instead of just making him seem incompetent when history required him to be. But in any case, Ezio enacts most of his killings over the course of 10 full years, and the passage of time is handled much better here than in other games. AC2 really feels like an epic, an exploration of a man who dedicated his entire life to one cause. It is in sequence 10, when Ezio is ruminating on the loss of his family and whether or not it was truly worth sacrificing a simpler life for revenge, that he is finally able to confront the big bad of the game, Rodrigo Borgia. We learn that Borgia believes himself to be what he calls the Prophet, a man who can open an ancient vault and access an impossible power within. As an antagonist, he's evil. That's what you get here. Not all villains need a tragic backstory, but again, you gotta go into this game knowing that the overall goals of the Templars are not going to be what carries this narrative like they are in AC1 or even AC3. It is in this confrontation that some weird things happen story-wise. Borgia flees because all of your allies throughout the game suddenly join you in this pivotal moment. Mario and all the other faction leaders of the thieves, courtesans, and mercenaries who aided you on your quest are here. Except, lo and behold, they were all assassins the whole time, and so was Niccolo Machiavelli, who was also here for some reason, out of nowhere. They meet him out of coincidence. They too were waiting for a prophet to arrive, and were surprised when Ezio showed up. They deduce he must be the prophet, and decide he's finally ready to join the assassins. This, to me, is the weirdest plot point in the entire game, and one I get stuck on during every replay. Like I said, this is 10 years into Ezio's story. From what we can tell, Ezio was the primary force fighting against the major Templar players during this time period. Why now, after Ezio is credited with clearing 2 cities of Templar influence, is he finally acknowledged by the assassins? Surely after all the Pazzi were killed, he had proven enough. Machiavelli just shows up here for the first time looking like Novak Djokovic, and I assumed he was the leader based on how he was taking control of the situation, but I looked it up and he's 17 here. But he is an assassin. I thought maybe it was because Ezio declined to join earlier in the game, but then immediately after we get this dialogue where Mario starts talking about how Ezio is finally ready. Like, what the heck are the criteria for becoming an assassin? Did his initial refusal really necessitate a decade-long ruse where everyone he met lied to him? It also falls flat for me as a twist emotionally because of the repetition of it. The very first twist of the game is Ezio, everyone closest to you is actually an assassin. We already went through this song and dance, and I don't get the value of giving that twist a part 2. I talk about this so much because it's such an important scene. It's where he becomes an assassin, and it recontextualizes everything you've done in the game prior to this. But it's done in such a weird way that it feels so needless for it to have been done like this. If anything, it makes the assassin seem weird and, again, incompetent. It doesn't help that the aftermath of this leads to some big endgame pacing issues, but these issues will actually be different based on when and how you played the game. If you played the game at launch, then you experience a 10-year time jump, Ezio has a beard, and worst of all, you're given a collectible quest to end the game. The codex pages scattered around the world are actually required to reach the ending, which would have been nice to know earlier. Reminds me a lot of the map quest at the end of Wind Waker, a full stop in progress for anyone who wasn't clearing out the world. But if you play the game now in its remastered version, or if you bought the DLC back in the day, you actually got 2 extra sequences to kind of fill in that gap. However, it's immediately apparent why these sequences were cut from the main game. You go from discovering the big bad's plot and gearing up for a climax, but then suddenly you're helping Caterina Sforza save her kids, and you're stopping the bonfire of the vanities. There is no way to skip these sequences. These are just a default part of the game now, and it really muddles up the last act as we go on these side quests that are somewhat related to the overall story, but really take you out of the main narrative. No matter how you play it, the game's transition into its final stretch is sloppy. When you have made it through all that, Ezio and the assassins are finally ready to take the fight to Borgia himself, who has managed to become Pope off-screen, which is kind of a big deal. This means that you're headed for the Vatican. I believe that this is the most fleshed out set-piece level in the game, and it ends with Ezio pouncing onto his target from above in the middle of Mass. We see Ezio, after all these years, still struggling with whether or not he fights for righteousness or himself, but he doesn't get to make that choice in the moment, as Borgia uses the power of the Staff of Eden to blast Ezio away and engage him in combat. Ezio, however, has the Apple of Eden, and in a really cool subversion of the first game, uses it to create clones of himself to fight Borgia. A wild final battle, but it's kinda cool. However, the staff wins out, and Borgia is able to grab the apple, and with the two combined, he has Ezio at his mercy. He stabs him, leaving him for dead. Borgia has won. But he hasn't because Ezio just gets up. Again, another really weird cutscene. Like, I get that in Brotherhood they say canonically Ezio has the armor of Altair here, which saved his life, but as a player, it was so jarring. It reminds me of AC1 where Al-Mualim has Altair paralyzed, but then just fights him for some reason anyways instead of just killing him because a boss fight needed to happen. Same kind of narrative dissonance here. It's just such a weird scene. What comes next, though, is the much-memed fist fight with the Pope. While they duke it out, it is clear that Borgia has incredibly heightened delusions of grandeur and believes only he deserves to open the vault, which I didn't mention is right here. He actually became Pope because this is where the vault is, and he needed the staff to open it, along with the apple that Ezio just gave him, so really weird that Ezio decided to bring it with him. I feel like that was the one thing the assassins were really trying to prevent, and even though Ezio won out here, pretty big risk to give Borgia the opportunity to maybe be able to open the vault. Ezio wins somewhat anticlimactically and decides to let Borgia live. He has beaten him and he is no longer a threat. Definitely a weird narrative choice given Ezio's comfort with killing throughout the game, but it represents the completion of his character arc. The solidification that he does what he does because he believes in it, in service of his new life, not to avenge his old one. Still, I don't love it. Having a Templar Pope can be good for no one, and honestly, it feels more like bad writing than a bad character decision alone. It just doesn't feel like they thought much about it. But to be fair, at the time, they didn't expect to be making a direct follow-up showing the consequences of this action. So with this final chunk of the game, I have been critical because it does really botch getting to these final moments, but when these final moments do come, I think they are handled really well. Ezio opens the vault. He is the prophet. He walks in, and a hologram of Minerva, one who came before, appears before him. She has a message for Desmond about the end of the world, and needed Ezio to be here so Desmond could hear it. We learn of an impending disaster, and we know Desmond is prophesied to be the one to stop it. Now here you've got to pretend it's 2009, and this isn't referring to him touching a ball after collecting a bunch of batteries, and this will come off as really cool. But this message is for Desmond alone, not Ezio. She demands he be silent as he listens. Ezio stands here in the vault his enemies destroyed his life to find, and is told he is nothing but a messenger. His final words in the game are not triumphant, heroic, or even ruminative. He ends the game begging this god to tell him what it was all for, but she has nothing to say to him, and the screen cuts to black. Ezio's story is over. He has played his part. This was a bold ending, and one that really stuck with me after the credits rolled. 20 years we spent with this man, more if we include his birth at the beginning. We see him evolve from a spoiled kid to a tired, weary assassin, and I have never been more attached to a protagonist in these games. And after all that pain and suffering, it was also Ezio could stand in the right place at the right time. That is what his family died for. That is what Petruchio died for. Now, of course, this was Ezio's ending for a couple months. AC2 was a hit, and Brotherhood was announced soon after, and so we see him move on from this, and eventually he's fighting people while free-falling off a cliff and blowing up people with a Renaissance-era tank, as heroes do. But for a while, this was where Ezio's story was complete. There is a joy in AC2 that AC1 doesn't have. There is more color, more comedy, and more tenderness. But when it wants to be dark, I think it goes darker than most other games in the series too, not out of any form of edginess, but out of a really harsh and real feeling bleakness. And this moment of emptiness where the hero is reduced to a blot on the pages of history hit me hard in 2009. I don't think any AC game has ended quite as powerfully as AC2, and to me, this was Ezio at his most thematically resonant. When all is said and done, the positives of this story far outweigh the negatives to me. It isn't perfect, and it doesn't do everything right, but it's beautiful. From the first hour, it dedicates itself to presenting the player with high stakes and likable characters on a chapter-by-chapter basis. There was never a point where I stopped caring about what was happening on the screen, something I definitely can't say for other AC games. Ezio is endlessly likable, the music is so perfectly immersive, and there is a willingness to balance fun characters and the beautiful landscape with heavier themes of grief, lack of closure, and uncertainty of purpose that even quote-unquote darker AC games don't pull off as well. There is a reason why, after all these years, no character's story has settled so firmly within the cultural zeitgeist as Ezio Auditore's. You would think that a video about what I consider to be the best game in the series would be a 100% glowing review, but while I love a lot about AC2, I do think it's worth acknowledging its flaws and what was legitimately improved by later games. But I look at where this franchise went, and it seems like Ubisoft has constantly been chasing the successes they found with this game, without ever fully understanding why it even worked so well. Obviously, we will never know, but I think back to Desilets and that original crew losing full control over Assassin's Creed, and I'm left wondering what might have been. You can tell that AC1 through AC Brotherhood were made basically by the same people. Each game iterates on what came before and responds to criticism by building on what people liked and cleaning up what people disliked. But starting with Revelations, the series stopped being the product of an individual team and started becoming Ubisoft's yearly game by committee. Mechanics stopped building on what came before and instead started moving laterally, adding really cool new ideas while also being plagued with problems that the Ezio trilogy had already solved. Despite AC2's imperfections, every other game in this series has either been too rushed, too derivative, or just too messy to really meet the same standard. And normally I wouldn't feel a need to make it a competition, but again, despite how incredible AC2 is, I really feel like it should have been surpassed by now. A game with the writing of AC4 and the world density of AC Unity and the creativity of AC Origins and the polish of Brotherhood. Every subsequent game has given us bits and pieces that, Frankenstein together, could totally blow AC2 out of the water. And yet, individually, every game falls short of the mark in one category or another for me. I look at Ubisoft now, struggling more than it has in a long time, both creatively and financially, and I wonder if this really is where Assassin's Creed will always have peaked. It has been hard to believe for a while now that the Ubisoft of today could really put together a game of this caliber, and there is disappointment in that. But as I get older, it matters less. Unreached potential is a shame, but AC2 is right here. The story, old and creaky as it is in a modern context, is still here. The passion is still here, the beautiful animations are still here, and Ezio is still here. If this is always the best AC will ever have, then I will always be content to pop in this disc and listen to Jesper Kyd and Roger Craig Smith absolutely kill it for another playthrough. That is all I have for today. Kind of a bittersweet video, but that is what AC is for me as a fan who really does enjoy these games, as opposed to someone who likes a couple of them and then hate plays all the rest. I had some trouble with this video because for whatever reason the words just weren't coming to me like they usually do, probably because of how much this game means to me and how much I do want to do right by it. In any case, on a kind of different note, I want to start ending my videos with an indie recommendation of the month, just for fun, and so for September here I am choosing Signalis. I got the Platinum for this game a couple weeks ago, and as a fan of old school Resident Evil, I really loved it. I definitely recommend it if you like horror games. Let me know in the comments what you've been playing lately. I'm probably going to pick up the Prince of Persia DLC soon, and I look forward to playing that. But in any case, have a great day, and take care of yourself.